Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Gray Matter. One of the wonderful things, maybe the best thing about doing this podcast, we started this a few months ago, and the audience and everything is really growing, and it's exceeded everyone's expectations. But one of the best things about doing this is I get to meet incredible people who are at the top of their fields, and to talk with them and to meet with them and to get to understand concepts and ideas and also people that I never would have had the opportunity to do otherwise, but for this program. And then, the exponential pay it forward is I get to share people like that with our audience. And we're very blessed to have one of these people here today, Kim Moody, one of the top tax experts in the country. I've had the pleasure of hearing this man speak many times, several times, and he's a very engaging person. I know we're going to really enjoy hearing what he has to say, and especially because he's an expert in areas that are very, very salient concern to many Canadians today. Things like, why are taxes going up? What's going on? Why does the carbon tax keep going up? Do I have to get taxed on CERB? Why is inflation going up? Why can't I afford to buy a house? Why is unemployment really, really down and interest rates going up? These are concepts that are beyond the scope of the knowledge of most people, including myself. And so this is going to be a very, very illuminating conversation. And more than that, Kim is not just a bean counter. I've entitled this episode "The Tax Man," which is a bit of a play on words, but of course he's not the sheriff of Nottingham. He's the guy who he helps you be Robin Hood, if you will. He's steeped in this stuff, but he also has a very, very clear 5,000-foot view, a broader sense of what's really going on in the economy, the undercurrents, and why things are happening in terms of our relationship with government and power and control, and how economic factors influence all of these. So, as we always do, I'm going to start with a couple of quotations just to frame the discussion. The first one is from an economist that I expect is probably familiar to Kim. A very famous Austrian economist named Friedrich Hayek from the 20th century. He famously quoted, I do not, of course, this is a translation from his native Deutsch, but he said once, I do not think it is an exaggeration to say history is largely a history of inflation, usually inflations engineered by governments for the gain of governments. And on the subject of tax, as we want to do on this show, I've turned back to my go-to person, who is Sir Winston Churchill. And he once said this about taxes. He says, I contend that for a nation to try to tax itself into prosperity is like a man standing in a bucket trying to lift himself up by the handle. But let's talk a little bit about Kim Moody. I'm going to introduce Kim now, if I may. Kim is the head man at a very successful firm called Moody's in Calgary, and they provide expert advice not only in tax but in corporate tax planning, estate planning, in international tax planning, personal tax planning, tax dispute resolution, U.S. taxation services. Full disclosure, I'm a client. I think these guys are great. They have excellent lawyers and wonderful people. They have a very, very service-oriented mindset, which is very rare to find among professionals. And that's not a slight at my colleague lawyers, although it's probably true in the broader sense. So here's a quotation from Kim. He says, people who know me know that I'm only really good at one thing. I doubt that that's true. But he says, tax. I'm the guy that carries the tax act everywhere. Dinner with my wife, hockey games, to bed. At least I started to look a bit cooler once it was available on iPad. It says here, the antithesis of the status quo. Kim is driven to innovate new and better ways to do things for the clients he serves, the advancement of the firm and other professionals in tax. His relentless obsession with getting to know everything in the Tax Act makes him a highly sought-out resource for peers and clients. In March of 2020, Kim published his first book, Making Life Less Taxing, And that's a nice play on words. Pay attention to your taxes so you can pay less tax and build a strong, smarter Canada. And this book was actually an Amazon bestseller. And we're going to get him to tell us before he goes about where you can find that book. Kim's primary area of expertise is tax and estate planning for owner-managers of private corporations and executives, particularly those who have entered into the tax complexities that come with being affluent. And he also says that deciding years ago that sleep was highly overrated, Kim makes time to share his knowledge through writing, lecturing, teaching, and being an active national leader in the tax profession. In 2016, he fulfilled his long-standing goal of receiving admission into law school and is currently exploring ways to fit this ambition into his busy schedule. We'll have to ask him how that turned out. Kim's unique ability is being a loyal, transparent, and honest intellectual rebel who always does the right thing. His passion to lead, teach, never settled, and both seek and speak the truth, aid in his contributions to the tax landscape. Kim desires to be an inspirational example for those around him and to continuously grow. He's the recipient of a number of awards, including the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Alberta Early Achievement Award in 2005. He's a fellow of the Chartered Accountants of Alberta. He's a recipient of the Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners Founders Award for Outstanding Achievement in 2013. He's a recipient of the Business in Calgary's Leader of Tomorrow Award 2012, recipient of the Canadian Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners Volunteer of the Year Award 2006, and very impressively, a recipient of the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012. He's also an author of a number of publications, essays in the area of tax, and a renowned expert in his field, and also one who I must say is very generous with his time and his knowledge, which is why he's here today on his own time and his own dime. And we're very, very grateful and honored to have him here. Welcome to Grey Matter, Kim Moody.
Thanks very much. Very kind. And just to clarify, you mean I'm not getting paid for this?
Well, yes, there's a basket, tax free.
I thought I was getting paid.
So Kim, we've gone through a little bit of your biography, and we want to get into picking your brain about some of the things, very confusing things that are going on in the Canadian economy. And I know a lot of people, including myself, are just really consternated and wondering, what is going on today? Why are groceries so expensive? Why is it $2 for gas? What's going on with the carbon tax? Before we go there, I wonder if we could just find out a little bit more about you. Would you mind just taking us through a little bit of your personal biography? Where you're from, school days, family background. How you founded Moody's. You want to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
How much time do we have?
Take as much time as you need. This is your time. We'll go as long as you want.
That means my fee increases. I love
it. Okay, fair enough. We're warned.
I'm just kidding. Yeah, I was sure. I'll give you a little bit of history about myself. I was born in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, of all places, and lived there until I was about 4. Moved to Alberta during the one of the first oil booms in the 1970s with my mother and father, and we moved to Rocky Mountain House to begin with, and then lasted there 9 months and followed the oil boom up to Fort McMurray. So I was raised in Fort McMurray as a youngster from 1973 to 83. And so my dad worked on the construction of the Syncrude oil sands plant. That's kind of what got us up there. And but Fort McMurray, I don't know if you've been there lately.
I've been many times.
Yeah, it's an interesting place, and as a youngster, it's a wonderful place to grow up. Lots of forests and rivers and lakes, so fishing and what have you. So I had just and great hockey town. Mm-hmm. So I had just a blast growing up. But it's a very much at the time, and to a certain extent today as well, very isolated. Roughly 4 hours north of Edmonton by car, so that's a long ways, and so entertainment starved. So my dad started a go-kart track in the early 1980s, and late 1970s is what I meant. Mm-hmm. And so my siblings and myself helped run that go-kart track as youngsters, and it was a stroke of genius by my dad because he was exercising his entrepreneurial juices, and and he really struck a chord with this particular go-kart track, and did very, very well financially, and he was really happy about it. And so during the 1980s depression, high interest rates, and the national energy program from Trudeau #1, that really brought a lot of devastation to Fort McMurray and Alberta in general. So we ended up moving, after selling the go-kart track, did pretty well, but moved to central Alberta and finished my high school in central Alberta, and went to university in Lethbridge, of all places. At the time, it was a top accounting school, and still a great university, but at the time it was one of the top accounting schools. And so I went there, got my CPA in Calgary, articling at a local small firm, and naively, and to this day, I still can't believe how much balls I had. But the day that I got my CA, I walked into my partner's office at the time, or the partner's office, one of the main partners, and said, "All right, when am I becoming a partner?" and you would know this. You're a lawyer. I mean, that's kind of like when you get called to the bar. You walk in and say, "When am I going to become a partner?" And so I got the usual answer saying, "Well, you work hard. Maybe 7 or 8 years. You bring it." And I said, "Okay, I'm resigning." Like, in hindsight, what did I expect? But I ended up with one of my colleagues starting our own accounting firm. I was going to be the tax guy, and he was going to be a valuations guy, and we were going to conquer the world. Well, holy cow! In hindsight, that was pretty naive, because as a fresh CA, nothing about tax, and I mean nothing. And so, and I quickly found out that I knew nothing, and so I quickly tried to find some professionals that would mentor me, and thankfully I did. And there were some great people along the way that helped me. And I write about this in my book. A fellow by the name of Ted Finningley helped me a ton, and Craig Jones, who's now Justice Craig Jones,
Right.
Very well known tax and trust lawyer, and he was very, very kind and mentored me a lot. And there's other people along the way, and then eventually, through various iterations, started the current version of Moody's in 2007 with a well-known lawyer, Dennis Nerlin, and so we tried to create the first multidisciplinary firm, within the existing abilities of the regulations and rules, which are not easy to navigate. Me being an accountant, and Dennis being a lawyer, but we did it, and successfully. And I bought out Dennis in 2012, and he came back to the firm last year before he died, unfortunately. But along the way, we converted into a law firm, which is now a full service law firm, which includes tax law, corporate and business law, immigration law, trust and estate law, and in 2017 we bought an accounting firm as well, and to make providing services to private clients all under one roof, within the confines and the abilities that the regulations allow us to do. And so that's us in a nutshell. That's my history. It's been
Incredible.
lots of learning and lots of fun.
Well, it's funny, Kim, that we already have a few things in common. Firstly, my family was also part of that same wave that came out from Saskatchewan, originally from Regina. So I have that in common, and then also, it sounds as though we both are the kind of person who tend to jump off a cliff and build a parachute or an airplane on the way down.
Yeah.
Yeah, and but also very entrepreneurial. But then also the other thing I hear that in your story that is similar to my own is that you had great mentors, and that is such an underrated ingredient to success in anything, isn't it? Like,
Totally
where would we
agree.
be but for our mentors? And of course, the way to sort of show gratitude for that is to be a good mentor yourself, to pay it forward. I'm reminded of a quotation from Gandhi you've probably heard, where the measure of a teacher is not what they teach, but how many leaders they've created. And so I expect that's probably you're probably viewed that way by the people at your firm. But I have to ask you, Did you actually take the plunge? Did you become a lawyer?
You know what?
You turned away, right? You turned away at the last.
Okay,
You went to go to the dark side.
here's the true story. I mean, as you know, Leighton, to practice tax as an accountant, you're pretty much practicing law without a license.
Oh,
right?
yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And so every time I open up the Income Tax Act and interpret a statute, and then followed up with the interpretation of case law, which is what I do every day, that's practicing law without a license. But,
Yeah.
and I'm not saying anything that's shocking. I mean, the Law Society of Alberta and all the provincial law societies know about this and turn a blind eye, and they have forever, because frankly, the accounting profession dominates the practice of tax in Canada, unlike other countries around the world. Like in the United States, for example, it's not as dominant, although it is still fairly dominant by accountants, but not as dominant. And so I always wanted to be a lawyer, but along the way had, my wife and I had a number of kids, and that became priority, and never regret that. Love having our four brats, four sons, and then finally in 2015 at Christmas time, I said to my wife, you know what, I should write the LSAT and just get it out of my system and go to law school. And she said, sure. So I thought, well, I'm a pretty smart guy. So I'll sign up for the February 2016 write. So I did. Sorry, February 2015 write, because I guess it was Christmas 2014. So I had my years wrong. So I bought a couple study books and I signed up for a weekend course and thought, holy man, I'm not doing so well in these LSAT questions. What the hell's going on? And so I took the write in February and I didn't do very well. And I thought, Jesus, well, I guess there goes my law school dreams. I guess I'm not as smart as I thought. And then the competitive nature in me thought, no way, I'm doing this. So I hired an LSAT tutor and met the fellow 3 days a week in my office at 6:30 in the morning until 8, 3 days a week, and wrote practice exams for 6 solid months. Ruined my summer holidays by doing practice exams throughout the summer on the beach of all places. And then I wrote in October, and I did much, much better. And so got admitted to USC, and I was going to start in September of 16. And so in August of 16, I was online buying my first year law school books, and my wife says to me, "You sure you want to go to law school?" I said, "Absolutely, I do." And so, are you married, Leighton?
Yes.
Yeah. So, as a good husband, I get up the next morning and I say, why the hell did she ask me that question? Because it didn't hit me in the face, to begin with, of course. And it's like, maybe she's a little worried about the time pressures and everything. So I went up to her and I said, honey, why did you ask me that question yesterday? Well, she goes, and so after much consternation, yes, she was worried that because I have a thriving practice and, the leader of the firm and busy kids, and that, that it would, something would have to give. And she was worried that the family would ultimately pay the price. And so I thought, all right, I'll take this on at another time. So long story short is I still have it on my bucket list. Might be next life, but we'll see.
Well, it sounds as though your wife performs the same function in your home that mine does, and that is she's the house of sober second thought. And
Yes.
I have a lot of ideas, and not all of them are good. And my wife has no compunction about telling me which ones she thinks are bad. And when I don't listen is when I usually get in trouble. So it's great to have that kind of support, though, isn't it? I mean, you
It
really couldn't
certainly
want
is.
to. I would bet you couldn't imagine the success of your career and your firm without having that support.
Oh, 1,000%. I wouldn't be here today without my wife, Vivian. So
yeah. So well, that's great. That's great to hear. So let's tackle a few ideas here, and want to pick your brain a little bit since
Sure.
we got you here. So I know the first time I heard about you, Kim, was probably some about 10, 15 years ago with your work or some of the things you were doing with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation.
Tax
So
Foundation, probably.
yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about, maybe start there, some of the work that you did there, and why you are obviously so passionate about tax and tax reform? Could you maybe describe where that's coming from?
Sure. I mean, anybody who knows me knows that I'm pretty curious guy, and I think you are as well, Leighton. I think a lot of people are, but I love to learn, and so my involvement in wanting to learn, the very complex area of tax, which I naively, as I already told you, I didn't realize even as a young CA how complicated and how vast and tax and tax policy is, and so that kind of led me to want to find organizations that would help educate me both on policy and on practice. And so I tripped across the Canadian Tax Foundation. It was actually one of my mentors that said, "This is, this is the pinnacle that you need to learn from and eventually contribute to." And so I did that, and eventually, spoke at a number of conferences and got invited to the to the board of governors, and eventually got invited to the executive and became the chairman of the Canadian Tax Foundation in 2011 and 12. And so, which really was quite interesting because the Canadian Tax Foundation is kind of the pinnacle of, it is the most respected non-advocacy body for tax and education and policy in Canada. And frankly, it's one of the most well-respected organizations around the world. So that really opened my eyes in terms of how many good people we have in that organization. And in Canada, Canada is blessed with some very, very good talent on tax policy, both in academia, not both, but in academia, in government, and in practice. And so just to hang around those people and learn and seek, glean a lot of that information. To this day, I feel very blessed that I was able to be around those people and contribute a little bit to the body of knowledge and in policy. In terms of my passion for tax reform and comprehensive review, I'm on record for saying this probably hundreds of times now. The last time Canada had a comprehensive, sober review of its entire tax system was from 1962 to 1966, when at that time Prime Minister John Diefenbaker took a real political risk and commissioned the Royal Commission on Taxation to study Canada's existing system of taxation and make any recommendations that it felt necessary in order to help Canada achieve a solid taxation system to provide for the public services that Canada needs, and to allow for it to be, to grow. And so it appointed, a pretty important person by the name of Kenneth Carter. So this commission became known as the Carter Commission, and it took 4 years to release its recommendations. And I got to tell you, there's many nights where I still, pull up the Carter Commission reports over a glass of wine, and this sounds geeky, but it's true, and read some of the recommendations, because this is one of the few reports that's been done over time, especially in tax, that's really aged quite well. Mm-hmm. And Canada debated the recommendations over a period from 1966 to 1971. I believe the finance minister back then, who ultimately implemented tax reform, was Finance Minister Benson, if I recall correctly, and into comprehensive tax reform in 1972. And the landmark recommendation in 1972 was the taxation of capital gains, which previously weren't taxed. And as you know, today in Canada, half of a capital gain is taxed, not 100%. And there's been variations throughout the years, but it was introduced in 1972 at 50%. Today it's 50% as well. And so that is the last time that we've had comprehensive review. We've had limited form review, with my good friend, Dr. Jack Mintz, who is a renowned Canadian economist. And frankly, I love any time I have speaking with that fellow. He's so knowledgeable and such a deep resource.
Mhm.
But he chaired a commission on business taxation in 1997, 98. And there's been little limited reviews here and there, but no party, whether it's conservative or liberal, federally, has had the political balls, uh, to call for a commission, because it is very risky politically.
Mhm.
Um, and as I was talking to, and I'll keep the person's name confidential, but one of the existing conservative leadership candidates knows my views on calling for comprehensive review and reform. And in a private conversation, we were, the fellow admitted that, yeah, it is politically risky, and and it's risky because you don't know the outcome. And as a politician, if you don't know what the outcomes are, then that could be fairly risky politically. But I
Mhm.
think that's frankly the beauty of a commission and comprehensive review and reform is, let's wipe the slate clean, because the world that we had back in 1962 to 66 and 72 is tremendously different than it is today.
Mhm.
And the Income Tax Act, is about that thick.
Yeah.
And it's literally a patchwork quilt of changes upon amendments upon amendments. And it's, the quilt that we had, the shiny nice quilt that we had in 1972 is pretty tattered and pretty patchworky, and it works okay, but it could be so much better to achieve Canada's overall objectives, both economically, the most importantly economically,
Mhm.
and take away some of the crap that's there. So anyhow, that's a long-winded answer to your question. I hope that's okay. But the
That's
bottom
great.
line is, the bottom line is, it's time, and it's been
Yeah.
time for quite some time.
So you have been quite prolific in writing about tax reform, particularly uh, beginning with the first Trudeau government. I recall seeing some of your essays and so on. You started to become concerned. Uh, you seemed to become very concerned about the way things were heading tax wise with some of the changes that came along with Mr. Morneau. And you started writing a lot about that. And so I'd like to take you there next, and maybe just give us an idea of what were the first signs that you were concerned about a significant shift in the way that taxes were going to be structured for Canadians once Bill Morneau came forward as the finance minister, and why were you so concerned? Because I know that you expressed very serious concern about how this is going to impact the economy, and of course, I think it's easy to say that you were right. That the changes. I don't think anybody. Well, I shouldn't say anybody. Um, very few rational people would be able to justify that the current Liberal government, or the Liberal government that we've had in place since 2015, that they have been very good stewards of the Canadian economy. But and I know which side of that ledger you're on, but I mean, it would be very hard to justify when you look at the state of the Canadian economy today versus what they were handed when Mr. Harper's government went out. A lot of things have changed. So what were the real sort of red flags for you when Mr. Morneau came in as the finance minister?
Well, the first obvious one when he came in was when the when Trudeau electioneered in the 2015 campaign that they would raise personal tax rates. And when Morneau got appointed finance minister, and that was one of the first, I think the first announcement that he made policy-wise, was that they were going to implement a 2% increase in personal tax rates for the so-called wealthy, which I guess is defined to be if you earn $200,000 or more, you're wealthy. And so I became very, very concerned then, because if you're going to do that in an already high tax rate country and single out a class of people being so-called wealthy, and we're going to ask them to pay just a little bit more,
Mm-hmm.
you could see the scripts coming out quite nicely, which of course politics are always scripted. But having said that, this was very flagrant, and I started to become very concerned about that. and started raising the alarm bell that, hold on a second here, in a race for talent, in a race for skilled labor, we don't need to go back to the late 1990s where we had, the so-called brain drain of doctors going south, because my concern was that, with already in Alberta, at least anyhow, with a depressing economy in the oil and gas industry, and filtering down to other areas of the economy in Alberta, and a 2% increase is going to cause some significant behavioral changes by shifting income, or maybe not reporting income in the most aggressive criminal way. So I started raising the alarm bell that we could see people doing that, in addition to just people leaving Canada.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And sure enough, we immediately in our firm saw lots and lots of interest on wanting to shift income, and defer income. And then, what's coming down the pipe, Kim? Should we be leaving Canada, or at least having those conversations? And so that was the first one. Fast forward to, a couple of years later, actually, before I move off the personal tax rate increase, I'll never forget this, and it didn't get enough press. It should have gotten a lot more press than it did. But, there's lots of fanfare that this 2% increase would increase revenues to the government by $3.2 billion. They quickly adjusted that down to, I'm just going from memory here, I think it was $2 billion, but still a significant number. When the numbers were finally reported, I think it was in 2017, that Statistics Canada finally reported how much money they collected off this increased tax rate. It was over $3 billion less. In other words, there is significant shifting and deferral of income.
Right.
And so is that, indicative of behavioral change? Absolutely. And Morneau pretty much said that. Oh, well, this is a temporary blip, and it's just a temporary behavioral shift. Well, of course it is. Mm-hmm. And you should have predicted that right up front, but more so predicted into the future, because, affluent people are not going to put up with, being treated unfairly, and so, or targeted for that matter. Fast forward to 2017, and in a fairly unexpected budget announcement in the 2017 federal budget, they said that they're going to study three things: income splitting with family members. They're going to study so-called surplus stripping, which is the conversion of otherwise dividends into capital gains. And then they're going to look at the accumulation of funds in a private corporation and the taxation thereof. So I'm sitting in the budget lockup in Ottawa when I read this, and I'm thinking, okay, I understand the income splitting. That's fairly straightforward. What the hell are they going to do there? They're not going to put a tax on dividends, are they? Like, they can't do that. Or like a super tax on dividends. That doesn't make any sense. Or are they going to put a reasonableness test on dividends? Because there's a reasonableness test on salaries right now, mm-hmm. but they're not going to do that to dividends. That makes no sense. What are they going to do about surplus stripping? I guess they could just introduce some legislation to make that go away. Okay, fine. But what are they going to do with passive income? That just doesn't make any sense. Fast forward to the summer, and they released their proposals. And July 18, 2017, I'll never forget it. I was walking down Main Street with my family on holidays at Niagara-on-the-Lake. You ever been to Niagara-on-the-Lake?
I have, yeah.
Beautiful area.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So my kids are getting ice cream. My wife is getting a coffee, and I was getting one with her, and all of a sudden my phone blew up. I thought, what the hell is going on? So I take a look, and all of a sudden my face just dropped. And I said, you know what, honey, I got to go read this. So I went and sat on a park bench for about a half an hour and read it and tried to absorb as much as I could. I could not believe it. And then pretty much my summer vacation was ruined after then. And flying all the way home, read the draft, the materials, and could not believe how mean-spirited that legislation was. Attacking entrepreneurs, a 90% tax on death if you held shares of a private corporation, which, I like to think that was an unintended result, but with this particular government, I don't think so.
Mhm.
And so it was, so fast forward to COVID and today, where there's been more and more stuff happen. There's a lot of worry out there about, are they going to introduce a wealth tax, or are they going to attack entrepreneurs even more? Are they going to increase personal tax rates even more? Are they going to change the capital gains inclusion rate, which a lot of us thought that they would do that in this last budget, which they didn't. So with the coalition of the NDP and the Liberals, I have to say at this point, I think everything's on the table, and it does scare me. So
Yeah.
there's another long-winded answer to your question.
Oh,
So,
that's a great answer, and I want to explore a little bit about this idea of taxpayer behavior. This is somewhat
sure.
fascinating because I read, and correct me if this is wrong, that during the same time when Morneau and company were increasing taxes in Canada, Trump was doing the opposite in the United States, and it had the opposite result. That is, when tax rates were reduced in the United States, uh, tax revenues went up because
Mhm.
people, the quote unquote, the greedy people who don't want to pay their taxes are actually less likely to engage people like you and will pay their taxes when they're, when they think that the tax rate is reasonable. Is that consistent with your understanding of taxpayer behavior?
Oh, for sure. I mean, are you familiar with the concept called the Laffer Curve?
No, no, I'd love to hear about it though.
So it's introduced by an economist, last name Laffer, and for the life of me, I can't remember his first name now. But in the 1970s, and he wrote it on a napkin. I actually have in my book, I have a picture of that napkin where he introduced, where he drew the Laffer curve, and it literally looks like a bell curve. Yeah, how do I do this?
Hmm.
Like that, right?
Right. Like
And
parabolic. Yeah.
yep,
Yeah.
that's too big of a word for me,
Oh,
by the way.
sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm a
So
lawyer.
parabolic.
Okay.
Huh. I'm gonna have to go buy me one of those. I'm just kidding.
I think Tesla makes them.
Oh, do they? Oh,
No, I'm
excellent.
just
I'll go
kidding.
buy one. I'll just download it. So anyhow, yes, parabolic curve,
Yeah.
and at the top of the curve is where the tax rate, whatever the tax rate is on that curve, where all of a sudden the amount of revenues that the government collects is at a maximum.
Right.
And any further increase in tax rates, the tax revenues go down, which is indicative of you get to a point in tax rates, personal tax rates or corporate tax rates, where the public has had enough, and they will do whatever they can, sometimes illegally, and sometimes by stretching the boundaries of the law to the maximum extent, where they will go out of their way to avoid paying that high tax rate. My experience, and this is just anecdotal experience, is that tax rate is somewhere in the 48 to 50% range. Like you have provinces in Canada, like Ontario, BC, to their ridiculous. I don't know why they did this in the last couple of years, but they increased their top rate to be identical to Ontario and Quebec and some of the maritime provinces to 54%. And I'm rounding, it's about 53 and a half. Can you imagine that? You're earning over $200,000. In many cases, you're entrepreneurs that have risked everything you have, and then you just happen to be so damn fortunate that you're making a decent living finally, and your personal income is over 200,000. You're going to pay on every dollar over that 54 cents on that to be left with 46 cents to pay your bills or to save for retirement or provide for your family. I mean, to me, that's egregious. And in my client base, certainly our firm's client base, there's not too many clients that disagree with that and will go out of their way to try and change their behavior. And lately, Leighton, that behavior has been through a confluence of a whole bunch of other factors, like the threat of a wealth tax, the threat of further increases in tax rates, either directly or indirectly, like the capital gains inclusion rate increase, for example, the luxury tax, on select luxury goods, which is such ridiculous policy for boats and airplanes and boats, airplanes, and vehicles. And so, things like that cause people to change their behavior. And lately, we have we have seen so many people leave Canada. I always tell this story publicly in the last couple of years. I've been practicing now for it's approaching 30 years. And in the first roughly 25 years, I probably had in my entire career maybe a dozen files where people were leaving Canada and becoming a non-resident of Canada. And mostly it was because, they're snowbirds and they just finally wanted to be in warm weather. So it's usually lifestyle related, and usually never tax. The odd exception to that was in the late 1990s when we had the brain drain, right? Where we had, the doctors that said, they've had enough and they're going to the United States, and the nurses. But I can tell you, in the last, especially 2 years, but certainly ever since this current government federally has been in power, I bet you we've had upwards of 200 files of wealthy Canadians leaving Canada. And, the amount of wealth that is exited it's all private. It's never going to get reported. It'll never show up in Statistics Canada reports, at least to my knowledge, it never will. And has been, high, at least upwards of $10 billion.
Wow.
And so tell me that that's good for Canada. With a small little office like ours,
Terrible.
it's terrible. Right? So,
and you were talking earlier, Kim, about how blessed we are in Canada to have, a wealth of knowledge in tax. And you were also talking earlier about this commission from the early 1960s. And I would wager then when that commission was going on, the commission received a lot of input and submissions from people like yourself. And then,
sure.
and then, as you say, flash forward to, the Morneau period, where they make all these, they impose all these new tax restrictions, and yet the tax revenues go down. That's a signal, on one view of the matter, that the people in private tax are maybe smarter than the people in government. And so, what's curious to me, and this maybe begs in favor of what you were saying before about our need for a commission. But what's curious to me is, why, given the wealth of people, knowledge that we have in Canada, people like yourself, given the failure of recent tax policy to increase revenue, why does the government insist upon sort of going off into its corner and playing in its own private cubicle, and not accessing the wealth of knowledge that's in the private sector, people like you? Because if they open it up and they sought the knowledge and expertise of people like your firm and others, in terms of creating a fair, rational tax code, it seems to me that would serve their interests in terms of increasing tax revenue, in terms of reducing the amount of tax avoidance that's going on, legal tax avoidance. But I guess my question is, why is this not happening? Why is the government not talking to people like you in terms of tax reform? Why is this conversation not happening? Because it seems to me to be to the benefit of everyone involved.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And the only answer I can come up with is politics. And I'm certainly no political expert, although I've certainly, become more involved in politics in the last number of years, simply because, tax is everywhere, right? And it's the most expensive thing you'll ever pay in your life. And so for anybody that thinks that politics and tax don't intersect, I mean, that's just naive. I start off some of my webinars now, especially when I review the budgets, and inevitably I'll get some smartass that says, no political comments, please. They'll put that in the chat line or something, or they'll put their hand up if I'm doing it live and say, I didn't come here for your political views. And, basically what I say to them is, well, there's the exit. Because it is so intertwined, right? Because when you're developing tax policy, it's not neutral. I think ideally it would be, but this statute is so intertwined with social policy, political objectives, yes, good economic policy, and you know, some taxation policy, but it's become a machination of a very mixed bag of policy. And so, to your question, why don't they listen? Because the politicians dominate, and to give a lot of the bureaucrats credit at the Department of Finance, I know a fair number of them in the tax legislation division. I wouldn't say I know the majority for sure, but certainly the ones I've dealt with, they are great. You know, there's a fellow that's in that department now who I know very, very well, and this fellow is a very smart, dedicated Canadian, and is passionate about making Canada better, but he's got no power, right? It's and yes, there's the odd bureaucrat that is just spiteful and wants to introduce draft legislation and get it past the politicians, but I would submit to you that those are rare. Most of the bureaucrats that I've certainly dealt with have been, you know, Canada's lucky to have them, frankly, for their dedication and passion. But it's really the politicians. Morneau might have been a very smart guy. I never met him personally. He certainly knew my name. I certainly knew his name. Do I agree with his politics? Not in the least bit.
No.
Does he agree with mine? Nope. So that unfortunately, I think, is the answer.
Well, let's talk a little bit more, maybe nuts and bolts here. You were talked about how you used the example of someone who's making, you know, a very, very handsome income that under normal conditions should give them the opportunity to live a relatively high standard, to a relatively high economic standard. But being able to keep 46 cents on a dollar is jeopardizing that, and it's punitive. So sort of in general terms, can you describe for people listening to this podcast why taxation that is that heavy is bad for the economy and bad for Canada?
Well, whenever you take money out of the hands of average Canadians, you know, there's less money to spend. There's less money to purchase goods. There's and so, you know, on that very basic foundational premise, you know, one would think one should be able to understand that. Lately, however, what we've seen is just, you know, because of COVID, and on the front end of COVID, you know, where we didn't really have a clue what was happening, and there was the real likelihood that people were going to be broke real quick. Yeah, we needed to pump some money into the system to make sure that average Canadians could put groceries on the table and make sure that they have a place to live and make their rent payments and mortgage payments. So I understand, you know, the introduction of money into the system on the front end. But as time went along, you know, and all of a sudden, okay, this is probably not the, you know, as dire as we thought it was in terms of economics. Maybe we should start turning that valve off a little bit instead of encouraging people to stay home. And so the amount of money that was pumped into the system, as you know, Leighton, it was tremendous. And as one of my you know, good friends, Pierre Polyev, often says, you know, which is, he's basically just trumpeting many economists. When you have too much money chasing too few goods, what do you get?
Yeah.
Inflation.
That's
right?
Milton Friedman, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just classic, right? Supply inflation. And so, no, I'm missing the phrase supply side. Anyhow, what the
Supply side economics. Yeah.
yeah, and so
Yeah.
so that's what's happened. I mean, the amount of money that is still in the system because of government supports and deficits, which we haven't, you know, even started to pay for the interest costs on this debt, and ultimately, you know, leaving this burden to our children and to our grandchildren and our great grandchildren. I worry about what that means to taxation rates, our taxation policies down the road, because somebody's going to have to pay for this, unless you're a subscriber to modern monetary theory, which is the government prints money. They don't. Who cares about debt? They'll just print more money. Which I got into a small debate with a financial advisor on that last week, and I thought, please tell me you don't subscribe to that theory, because there's so much wrong with that theory.
Yeah.
And
There
so,
is actually, speaking of, well, I mentioned Milton Friedman. I don't know if you've read this, but in one of his books, I think it might have been, it was one of his books. He actually disputes and he takes apart the theory, the generally accepted theory that greedy capitalists and the fall of the stock market in 1929 caused the Great Depression. And he actually, Milton Friedman's theory was that it was actually mismanagement of the money supply by the U.S. government and by other world governments actually set in motion the wheels that caused the Great Depression. So it's very interesting to hear you say that. But my question for you, Kim, and this is kind of an interesting one, and one honestly I don't fully understand, is the relationship between tax and inflation. And I'll give you an example, and you can go into more detail, but just give one example. I've heard some people I've heard it said that governments actually, on one basis, actually like inflation because the inflation of the dollar has a beneficial impact upon public debt. Does that make sense to you, or do I have that wrong?
no, you generally have that right. And Canada's seeing the benefits of that right now. And I use that in air quotes, benefits.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I know what you mean. Sarcasm.
Because, the recent budget showed that there's increased revenues to the government, taxation revenues. Well, why? Well, it's because overall sales are higher, which means that overall profits generally, not always, for businesses are higher, and therefore there's more taxation revenue in the system. And on the personal side, if your wages are going up, then personal taxes are going up, which inevitably, if costs are going up, where tax hits the road, especially on the personal side, is if inflation is going up, which makes it harder for the average family to put groceries on the table. Just as a quick aside, my wife and I went to the grocery store. This is about, I don't know, a month ago, and we were having some people over at our house. Thankfully it wasn't illegal anymore to have people over at our house. Which, don't get me going on that. But why did you get me going on that, Leighton? Jesus.
That's what I do. I'm a conversationalist.
Anyhow, we're having people over at our house, and these particular people, including me, like gin, and so we thought, we'll buy some limes. And so went to the where they have a bunch of limes, and I just started picking off and putting it into a bag. And I had probably about 20 limes in this, little small limes. And then I look at the price, just because I normally I don't, because they're usually 30, 40 cents, $1.49 per lime. And I thought,
wow,
are you kidding me? Well, there goes those limes, because that would have cost me those 20 little limes would have been whatever that, $30.
Wow.
And then, my wife and I like soda water, and we like the Pellegrinos.
Right.
And so normally, a can, a box of 8, $6.99, $7.99, $9.99. That's a 20% increase right away. And so you multiply that all the way through, and fortunately, I make a good living, so I'm always going to be able to put food on the table. I hope. But how many people, especially single mothers, single fathers, don't have that luxury and are living on a fixed salary or fixed income, where all of a sudden you have 20% price inflation. So what happens? Well, then you get wage inflation at some point, because these people who can't afford to put food on their table or are squeezing it are going to go to their bosses and say, I need a raise. And we're already seeing that happen in real time. So then what happens? Well, of course, more personal tax revenues to the government. And but is it cyclical? No, that's not what I'm sorry, I'll take that back. Is that good overall for the economy? No, it's not. And this is where we've had a balancing act over time. And I'm not an expert in this area, Leighton, but the monetary policy by the Bank of Canada, which really tries to use their levers, such as interest rates, to ensure that the economy is not overheated, to ensure that wage inflation is kept in check, and right now what are we going to see? Significant interest rate increases, which is going to do what? Well, it's going to put the squeeze on a lot of people who are highly leveraged.
Right.
So it's a scary time out there.
Mm-hmm. So, taking a bit of a 5,000-foot view here, and you sort of we're entering into this, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, Kim. Um, in my work, as I think you know, I'm representing a lot of Canadian worker groups, like thousands of them, and they have the sense, and I have the sense that the Canadian working class, which has been the engine of our economy, um, and which has also had the, you know, by and large, the political power in this country in terms of being able to elect governments, they're very much under attack through taxation, through COVID policies, in particular, even things like vaccine mandates. We have over 6 million people in this country who are living in the world's largest prison. They can't travel on an airplane or a ship or a train to get to work. Especially a number of people who work, who travel for work, salespeople, people who go across the borders. So, is it your view? Do you agree that that some of these policies, including tax policies and other economic policies that this government has engaged, I'm talking about the federal government now, seem to be targeted at the working class to remove their ability to earn income, to acquire personal property, and to keep it?
I would say unreservedly yes. Now, just for the record, the vaccine mandates, I think, is one of the most disgusting things I've ever experienced in my entire life. Whether you agree with vaccines or not, I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
But to label a group of people who, for a variety of reasons, does not want to take a vaccine or can't take a vaccine, and prevent their ability to make a living is disgusting and frankly un-Canadian. So that's my view.
Mm-hmm.
I know there's a lot of people that don't agree with me. I don't care.
There's a lot of people going woo woo right now when they hear that.
Yeah.
You're gonna have a lot of new fans, Kim. You have to change your Facebook page.
Good, because I think anybody who's trumpeting a pro-vaccine mandate is something I just can't relate to. Right. I mean, if I want to take a vaccine, which for full disclosure I did, doesn't mean that I need to hang around only vaccinated people. That's right. Disgusting in my view.
Yeah, that's just a personal health decision that you made, that you're entitled to make, and it's not anyone's business. Right. Yeah.
In terms of tax, I think this is where the kinder side of me wants to give any government, whether it's the current government or prior governments, the benefit of the doubt in terms of, maybe you just haven't fully thought through, the implications of some of these tax policies that you're thinking about. But then when you actually point it out to them, and I'll give you a specific example in a second here, and they still don't do anything about it, then the kinder side of me goes away. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. So in 2017, as we already talked about, Morneau introduced his package of proposals, July 18th, 2017, and one of them was on the anti-income splitting rules with dividends. And so I know you act for a lot of small business owners, so do we. Our clientele tend to be fairly affluent, but most Canadian business owners are not that affluent. They're simply buying themselves a job to put food on the table, and that's by far and large. That is the vast majority of small business owners. The restaurant across the street from my office here in Calgary Mission, which unfortunately finally had to shut down because of COVID mandates and rent increases and inflation. They just couldn't make a living anymore. But that is a typical small business in Canada, and in many cases it's run through a corporation, and the mom and the dad own the shares, for example. And so in many cases what happens is you pay your corporate tax, small as it may be, and then pay out dividends or salaries to the family. So when they introduced these anti-income splitting rules, or what is affectionately in our world called tax on split income, TOSI, when you actually run through the mathematics and see the implications of who this is impacting, it's actually impacting the lower and middle income, which I don't even know what middle income means, but I'll just use that phrase anyhow. Let's just say anybody with $100,000 or less of income, and even 80,000, where we ran some numbers and showed it to the government, the tax rate on these rules are well above what they would earn, what they would pay in a so-called wage, if they just simply earned a wage.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one would argue, well, that's the policy. They want to punish people for doing that. Why? What should be the difference between earning a salary and a dividend? And have this policy targeted at small business owners, because these rules these rules impact people who earn less than $200,000, because they want to try to avoid people using graduated tax rates, right? So do you think the multimillionaires are using, did they care about these rules? No, because the impact is if they're impacted by these anti-income splitting rules, they're going to pay the highest tax rate. Well, they're already paying the highest tax rate. So who are these rules targeting? They're targeting low and middle income people. I find that disgusting in the whole scheme of things. And there's numerous examples of that, but that's one of them. Another one would be the disability tax credit. In order to get the disability tax credit, you have to get a certification. It has to be certified by a doctor. I ran across one of my LinkedIn followers, a really good doctor out of Nova Scotia. And this guy is so kind and so smart and such a proud Canadian that he does certifications almost as he takes his weekends and has a whole stack of certifications and goes through them and gets them done. And he showed an example on his LinkedIn account the other day and this was an actual sign. He took a photograph of it, and it said, Dr. So-and-so does not certify disability tax credits. Well, that's a breakdown of public policy, right? Because if you all of a sudden have doctors that routinely say, no, I'm not going to do this, but the Income Tax Act requires it, well, who's that hurting? That's hurting people who need those credits, and they're usually low income. And so, that's another breakdown where I'd really, I would hope that comprehensive review and reform would target stuff like this and just take a look at how do we get the benefits of, how do we get benefits to the people that truly need it without attacking the successful?
Well, Kim, I realize that you're not an economist, but from listening to you and from some of your writings, it's very clear that you watch government policy, tax policy, monetary policy very, very closely. And a lot of people are wondering about things like, they hear about the World Economic Forum and, the UN 2030 agenda that, you will own nothing and you'll be happy. So I wonder what your thoughts are about this. Now, are we, and this may be an oversimplification, but are we dealing with a government that really has a poor, inept understanding of tax policy and of how to present a proper budget, how to manage the economy? Or are we dealing with a government that actually has a bona fide, to use your word, mean socialist agenda that's dedicated to transitioning Canada from the economy that we knew, the type of country that you and I grew up in, to something else?
Yeah, that's a tough one for me to answer, because when I look at the World Economic Forum as an example, do I like a lot of what they put out? Virtually nothing do I like what they put out publicly. I'm quite familiar with what you mentioned. You'll be happy. I think it's the 2030 agenda.
Right. Yeah.
The stuff that resonates that sits on their website, I virtually disagree with all of it. There's nothing on there that, in my view, what good is there to take cold showers, as an example, which is another thing that they trumpet? You should take cold showers. Okay, well, the better part of me says that maybe they're saying that to try to save energy. Okay, but are you doing it yourself? Are you taking cold showers? Because I don't know too many people that like to take cold showers. And yes, there's no shortage of articles out there that says that if you take a cold shower, you're going to feel more energized. But I don't know about you, Leighton, but I like warm showers.
Me too.
And and especially in Canada, where today, as we're recording this, it's what, too damn cold, +8. I saw another one on their website where it says that you should move to tiny homes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I like being me. I like being an individual. I don't like wearing a mask because I like to be able to show to the world that I'm a unique individual. And I like to be able to read you and communicate with you with that as well. So I like my freedoms. And so with that, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but is there anything to learn?
You are.
Am I? Okay. Now, the conspiracy theory side of me wants, hopes to God that that a lot of that stuff is just that. It's conspiracy theory, and it's being propagated by people that don't know what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you actually see it in plain writing and you say, holy Jesus, like who are these people? It's and why? What's the motivation on why they're doing this? Then it does get the juices flowing and at least thinking. And do I think that that socialism is a good thing? No, I don't think there's anything good about socialism. I like being an individual. I like freedoms. I like to be able to mentor people to do well for themselves and be a leader. And I think that's one of the wonderful things of being a human being is the celebration of individuality for the collective good, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to we're all supposed to be ants and providing for the queen. I don't think
Right.
so.
Yeah.
That's not the world I grew up in. And in any think tank or left-wing think tank, or especially a radical one like WEF, and there's no shortage of radical left-wing think tanks, I just don't buy into. Sorry, I don't buy into the whole phrase of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or what Dr. Peterson calls DIE. Right?
Yes.
Same kind of idea.
Mm-hmm.
Diverse from whose perspective? Inclusion from whose perspective? Equity from whose perspective?
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying that I shouldn't be an individual? Sorry, I'm just not buying it. So anyhow, I could go on and on.
Interesting. No, and that's very interesting. And the reason why I ask is, I mentioned Dr. Friedman a couple of times because I've just reread recently one of his books, which is called Capitalism and Freedom. And in that book, of course, he's a 1976 Nobel Prize winning economist. He's a libertarian and talked a lot about monetary policy, tax policy. But Dr. Friedman was famous for noting that throughout history, you will never find a society or a nation in which economic freedom was not tied to political freedom. In other words, where individuals, the working class, they do not enjoy economic freedom, the kind you're talking about. There is no political freedom, and a lot of people don't realize this. But the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union had a constitution that looked very much like the American Constitution, but it was meaningless because, of course, nobody in the society had any economic ability to act out freedoms, to make choices, to make decisions that would impact their, that have their ability to live out their lives and to self-determine. And so that's why I mention it, because the concern that a lot of Canadians have with there is a connection between, there seems to be a connection between these economic pressures that we've talked about that are being placed on working Canadians, and also the coinciding disintegration or shrinking of political freedoms. And so that's really what I was driving at. And I was interested to know, what you thought about that. If you're seeing sort of that same kind of trend, it sounds as though you do, and that you are concerned about it. Is that fair?
I would say that's fair. Yeah. And I'm glad you reminded me about Dr. Friedman's writings. It's been a while since I've actually, read some articles by him, but that makes sense to me. Political um, and economic freedoms need to be tied together, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense to me. And certainly, the last 2 years have been examples where, those have not been the case. And so, am I concerned about Canada? Yeah, sure. Absolutely I am.
So, coming back to your expertise as a tax man, in your view, if you if you own the world, or at least Canada, let's say you're the new Minister of Finance in Mr. Poilievre's new government, or let's say you're one of the key advisors to the Minister of Finance. What would be the key tax reforms that you would be recommending to Mr. Poilievre's new government? And we can both agree that Canada would be in a much better place if he were prime minister instead of the current.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that. I think I would try my best to try to convince Pierre and his colleagues that comprehensive review is worth the political risk. That would be my top one. And yes, it's littered with risks and littered with things that I probably haven't even thought about because I don't have the expertise in it. But having said that, nothing in this world comes without risks. And I think the rewards for Canada would be potentially great. So that would be number one. Number two would be an advocacy for the reduction of personal tax rates federally. Now that comes at an economic risk because that is by far the biggest revenues that Canada as a country earns is from personal tax revenues. And so obviously I'd want to work with the government to number one, eliminate that 2% surcharge on so-called high income earners. That would be a no-brainer. But let's bring it down even more. And maybe we do that in favor of, what Dr. Mintz always says, an increased consumption tax, which is a much fairer tax.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about that in my book as well.
Do you mean like a GST, Kim? Is that along those lines? Okay.
Yeah. Now, of course, the conservative government back in the 1990s paid the price for introducing the GST, but frankly, it's one of the best tax policy decisions that was ever made in this country, was, in my view, even though it's not politically popular, is to introduce the GST. But I'd like to see it come with reduced personal tax rates. I'd like to see the elimination of many preference tax items, like, for example, the small business deduction. Don't need it. Get rid of it. It's too complicated. And instead, just have a lower corporate tax rate for everybody, instead of just a small for small business rate, and then a higher one for general rates. No. Just have it like the UK has it. One rate, simple. Which leads to probably my overall recommendation is we have to find a way to make the administration of tax and the interpretation of tax much, much simpler. Albert Einstein is famous, and there's debate on whether or not he said this. I like to think he did, but he said there's nothing more complex than the income tax. and I think he's right. There's much more important things than income tax, like medicine and physics and what have you. But that stuff is comparatively is not that complicated. Yes, it's complicated. Believe me, I don't get it.
Yeah.
But if you live in my world, the tax world, holy cow! I mean, thankfully I like it, but it's complicated, but the administration of it. You shouldn't have to pay a guy like me $1,250 an hour to give fairly straightforward advice to a small business owner on routine matters. Like, how do I pay myself? Should I pay my debt versus keeping the money in the company? Those are simple things in the whole scheme of things. But unfortunately, the Income Tax Act makes it very, very complicated. And so I think overall simplicity is an objective that I would strive hard for, which is easier said than done.
Right. It always is. I agree with you about the complicated part. And I'll just confess that my first law job was actually working for the Minister of National Revenue, the government of Canada, and I only lasted about 18 months. And that was honestly, that was part of the problem. I just found the tax rules so complicated, and I spent a lot of my time in the informal procedure process, you know, fighting with people over small tax debts and things like that.
Yeah.
And that part of it really, it hurt my conscience actually, to be sort of a legal tax collector. But the other part of it was, it was just so complicated. So hats off to you. God love you for doing what you do. So I realize it's not fair to you, and I would never ask you to give sort of general off the cuff advice about particular, income tax situations. But I wonder if you'd be willing to just give people a few general tips, ideas that they could follow, that could help them, reduce their either reduce their tax exposure generally, whether they have let's say someone who has a small business, or they have a job, things that they could do, or other things that they could do to perhaps try to reduce or better manage their money in order to avoid tax. Do you have any sort of general tips? I know that you guys publish a terrific newsletter that I follow closely that gives, advice like this and more detailed stuff. But are there a couple of just general tips that you'd be prepared to pass along?
Well, I actually write about this in my book that I published. And I'll just give you a very high level one.
Okay.
Which, and the very high level one is, and I rip off Scotiabank. They've got a
good.
Well, I rip off their sayings. So I'm not actually ripping them off, but they've got a tagline that says, "You're richer than you think."
Right.
I love that. Right.
Yeah.
That's a great tagline, because in tax, I would say probably 8 times out of 10, you're richer than you think, because for many people. And I go into a fair amount of detail in my book on this little cycle, but think about, when do you actually see tax articles show up in the media? I'm going to test you here, Leighton. When's probably the first time in the year? Is it January, February, March, April?
Yeah.
Or is it the summertime, or is it late year? When's the 2 times of year that you see tax articles?
Usually it's around tax time, when it's time to pay, March or February, when they start getting into RSP season, or else when there's a new budget coming in, there's new taxes coming up. Those are the 2 times that I generally see them.
Right.
But
so the spring, which is when tax filing deadline is. So like clockwork, you usually see tax tips for Canadians that come out in, February or March. And usually that's right around the budget as well. So you have some flurry of activity. And then fast forward to December. Oh, and you got your year-end tax planning tips that come out as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like the journalists, I love them to death, of course, because they've got a job to do. But today's journalism is certainly a lot different than when we grew up. But having said that, they diarize, right? And it's so obvious. Let's pick up a tax article in February, and let's pick up one at year-end. It's well, that's not tax planning. And to be educated by the media on tax, who all they typically do is phone geeks like me and say, "Hey, can you give me 10 tips that for Canadians?" And they're worth nothing. It's things like, at the year end, make sure you do your charitable donations by December 31. Okay, big deal. Make sure you have all your medical expenses documented. Like, come on. So what I suggest in my book is, don't follow that pattern. Don't become interested in tax by the media's rhythm. Become interested in tax. And actually, I'm a little bit of a smart ass. I'm sure you'll be surprised by that, in my book, where I said, "What are you doing tonight?" I think I start off one chapter saying, "What are you doing tonight?" Oh, nothing. Let's do your tax return. And so I go on and basically say you should be thinking about your tax year round. And
Mhm.
I exaggerate by saying you should think about it every single day, which I'm not
Wow.
far off on that. But the best thing you could do is to take an active interest in your tax situation. Go talk to somebody that's educated on it. Bookkeepers are good, but they're not tax experts. You know, your average accountant is a decent accountant. They're not generally tax experts. So gauge the level of tax expertise you need. If you're a complicated fellow, then go get specialized tax advice.
Mhm.
If you're an average person, a wage earner, then maybe your average accountant is good.
Mhm.
But take a regular look so that instead of February and December,
Mhm.
um, and you'll often find things that you hadn't thought of.
Mhm.
You know, maybe you should be maybe it does make sense to refinance your house, for example, so that you can take an interest deduction, so that you can get a portfolio of funds. You know, but maybe from an investment perspective, it doesn't make sense to do that. But from a tax perspective, it might.
Mhm.
So which one rules? Well, typically investment is more important than tax, but it is things to look at,
Mhm.
and with a competent financial advisor.
Mhm.
So that's a long-winded answer again,
We
but a
love
very
those on
high
this
level.
show. We love those. There's no time limit. There's no commercials, Kim. Yeah,
I
these are
just
all
don't want
good.
to be boring. So
No, not at all. One of the things that I have a son who's just graduating high school, another one who's a bit younger. And one of the things that really is appalling to me, and I expect you'll agree with this, is the complete lack of any type of education in economics and tax. Um, in fact, even tax law is an optional course in law school.
I know.
And it seems to me, based upon what we've learned in the last hour and a half or so talking to you, taxation is a hugely important part of our lives. You said, and I think quite accurately, it's the most expensive thing we're going to deal with in our lives, and yet
Completely.
we receive almost no education in it. Like,
I know.
do you have any idea why that? And no one's calling for it. No one's saying, "Wow, we should really have basic economics." You should be reading, Thomas Sowell or Jack Mintz in high school.
Yeah,
We'd be just a much smarter country, wouldn't we? If
we
if we
would.
had that type of education.
I saw an article, and I haven't, admittedly, I haven't dug into it, but I think it was Governor DeSantis in Florida
Right.
just introduced legislation to make financial education mandatory
Oh,
in
wow.
high school. And again, I don't know much about it, but I just read that a little while ago. We don't obviously have that in Canada. But let me tell you a story that happened about 2 weeks ago. So if your kids, how old's the one that's
My
in high school?
my oldest is 18 and my youngest is finishing ninth grade.
Okay. So your 18-year-old would have taken, the hell do they call it here in Alberta?
Yes.
Uh, one of the most ridiculous courses
I thought it was short for communism, and it actually wouldn't have surprised me.
career and life management, I think. Career
Yeah.
advancement and life, something like that, I think
Yeah.
is what it stands for. So I have four boys, and the youngest, the oldest is 26, and the youngest is now 17 in grade 11. He's taking comm. And every single one that's taken comm, I've shaken my head at. Like, just, are you kidding me? This is what you're teaching our kids in terms of financial education.
Mhm.
And I've been really tempted to offer to go and teach the bloody class myself, on at least basic economics and tax. Nobody's taken me up on it yet.
Yeah.
But my true story, 2 weeks ago, my 17-year-old came home and said, Dad, you wouldn't believe what happened to me. And he pulls out his phone because he had frantically typed and wanted to read quotes from his teacher, his comm teacher. And the quote was something like this. It was, all corporations are bad because they're out to make a profit.
Oh my goodness.
And I said, read that to me again. And I'm shortening what he actually,
Yeah.
what the teacher said, but it was all corporations are bad because they're out to make a profit. Now that's being taught to our kids along with a whole bunch of other stuff like critical race theory and,
Yeah.
and diversity,
Yeah.
equity, inclusion stuff, which I'm not fans of. But
Mhm.
on the financial side, on the tax side, which I am an expert, you're telling me that corporations that provide jobs, contribute to society by tax revenues, and contribute to communities are evil because they're profitable, because they're somehow capitalist?
Mhm.
Like, we need good, unbiased, unpoliticized financial education for our children, and unfortunately, we're not seeing that.
Including about income tax and our exposure to it, right?
Completely.
Yeah, because I mean that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to have you on the program, because I think many people are going to are going to not only learn a lot just from what you've told us, but also and this is my segue from where you're going to point them to sources of information apart from your own book. So we've kept you here quite a while, Kim, and we're so grateful for your time. This is the part of this podcast where we sort of give people a homework assignment or reading list, an idea. So let's start with where can people find you? Now, I know you have a very active presence on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
There's a lot of really great information on your firm's webpage. There's your newsletter. But if people want to find out more about you and what you guys do and your own writings, where would they go? Where would they find that information?
Probably what is the sources you already mentioned. The website that we keep fairly robust, and we update it quite routinely. My personal LinkedIn page is pretty robust. Those are probably the first, the go-tos.
What about your book? Where can people find your book? That was published in 2020 when you wrote that?
Yeah, it's great timing. I worked on it for about a year and a half. Here, actually, I'll just show it to you. Can I
Yeah,
go
great.
grab it?
Yeah.
Um, so,
There it is. It's on the screen.
oh, there it is. Yep.
So
You got it. I didn't
would
even have
people
to.
be able to find this at say Amazon or Barnes
Yes.
and Noble, any of those places where they normally
Yep.
find books? Okay, great.
Yep. And you can see it's not very thick, right? And the
Not as
first
thick as the tax code.
no, the tax act is about that thick. So,
Yeah.
but the first chapter talks about, it has the. Were you a Seinfeld fan?
Oh yes, absolutely.
So I talk about my very first, or sorry, one of my favorite episodes of Seinfeld is about. You remember the tax write-off episode?
Oh yes.
And so for your viewers that don't recall that, so Jerry's having trouble with the stereo that he bought, and so Kramer bounces in and says, "Well, let's," he goes, I'll take it, I'll smash it, and I'll bring it to the post office," and something along the lines of, I'll cash in on the insurance."
Yeah.
And Jerry says, "You can't do that." And he says, "Well, sure you can. It's a write-off for these big companies." And so the whole exchange about it's a write-off. And finally Jerry says, "You don't even know what a write-off means." And sure enough, he doesn't. Right. And so that's a segue into a whole topic about, just the
Oh
mythology
yeah.
of tax. Like, there's no shortage of people, and I write about this as well. How many times have you been to a cocktail party and you get somebody that brags about their latest purchase? Oftentimes it's a cottage or a car or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And, they bought it through a corporation because, their buddy told them to, and they're going to save a bunch of tax. I mean, I get crap like that all the time. And so the evil part of me says, maybe I should burst this guy's bubble. But then the kinder side of me says, yeah, we'll let him brag. And so anyhow.
Well, it sounds like a great book. I'm looking forward to reading it, especially the chapter about Kramer and Seinfeld.
Well, that's the very first paragraph. So
So apart from your own book, which sounds like it's a must read, are there any other sources where you would point people to if they wanted to find useful information about taxation? You mentioned Jack Mintz. Would that be maybe a little above the reading level for people who aren't experts in tax? Is there any sort of more digestible sources you might recommend where people could go just to learn a bit more about taxation and the types of things that we've been talking about today?
Yeah, that probably is. I mean, Jack is brilliant, but
Yeah.
um,
I
Canadian
would think
tax.
that might be over the heads of some people who don't have a really strong background in taxation and economics, right?
Yeah,
Well, I'll tell you what, you think about that for a second. I'm going to give mine. I'm going to buy you a
sure.
little bit of time here. I've been talking about Milton Friedman a lot because I'm a big fan of his, and his book. He wrote many wonderful books. He was one of the great economists of the 20th century. He was at the University of Chicago. Thomas Sowell, for people who know that name, and if they don't, they should, was one of his students there at the University of Chicago. And as I said, Nobel Prize winning economist in 1976. One of the reasons why I like Milton Friedman is because um, in his earlier life he was vilified, and he was told that basically that he was a quack and a fool, and none of his ideas made sense. And then later on, he was totally vindicated. Sort of like Linus Pauling. If you know what Linus Pauling was, he was the guy who said that vitamin C was something that people should be taking in large quantities to activate their immune systems. And the scientific community made a big joke about him. And then in the early 90s, lo and behold, he wins a Nobel Prize in science. Anyway, Milton Friedman wrote a number of wonderful books. The one I'm referring to, I have referred to during the program today, is called Capitalism and Freedom. And I mentioned this one because it is written with his wife Rose. And my impression with reading some of Dr. Friedman's books is that Rose, she was brilliant in her own right, but she was very good at maybe bringing some of Dr. Friedman's ideas down out of the clouds. And so this particular book I found is somewhat more maybe more readable, not as dense as some of the stuff that Milton Friedman wrote. But he's a great writer of prose and just a brilliant man. This book in particular talks about how can we benefit from the promise of government while avoiding the threat it poses to individual freedom, which of course Kim has talked about today. And in this classic book, Milton Friedman provides the definitive statement of his immensely influential economic philosophy, one in which competitive capitalism serves as both a device for achieving economic freedom and a necessary condition for political freedom. So with that, Kim, I bought you some time. So we come back to you on our game show. And so do you have some ideas, a reading list or even a website or a particular journal that you would recommend to people in terms of maybe learning more about income taxes and how to manage their finances?
You know, there's no shortage of dense material out there that for any tax geek I would list lots and lots and lots. There is a huge void of plain English resources on tax. And while you bought me some time there, I was scrambling to think of any that I know of or that I routinely go to or recommend. And frankly, there's none.
You got to
The
write
only
another
thing,
book, Kim.
yeah,
This is volume 2.
most people that I admire and that are good tax writers are very technical writers.
Right.
And but I will give Canada Revenue Agency some credit over the years, and I probably the answer. The one thing I'll recommend is the Canada Revenue Agency website.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Over the years, they have really, really improved their communications, and they've put out what they're now calling folios on specific topics, and it's very good. Like for example, there's a lot of individuals who come to me prepared, and they want to leave Canada, they want to become a non-resident Canada. And to their credit, they've tripped across the Canada Revenue Agency's folio on residency, individual residency. And that makes my job easier because that particular folio is written in pretty plain English, and it's a good summary of the law. And it's not, completely anybody that wants to apply to their own situation. I mean, good luck to them. But at least it dumbs it down to a level that the average person can understand. It's like me going to my doctor. Doc, am I going to live? Well, you got, and then there's some unbelievable language that, there's no shortage of books that have unbelievable language, and you got to piece the puzzle together yourself. There's no shortage of advisors that like to do that. And I have no idea why they like to do that other than, self-inflated sense of worth, I guess. But I
Right.
find the Canada Revenue Agent's website over the years has done a pretty good job of appealing to the average Canadian. The danger, though, is that's not a complete code, and it's not the law. It's the
Right.
CRA's. If you worked for the CRA, then you knew this. It's their interpretation of the law.
Mhm.
And so, but having said that, that's probably where I would point people the most.
Right. But for more specialized tax advice, obviously, you would recommend that they talk to somebody like you, like the lawyers at your firm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially if they're
Fantastic.
complicated. Yeah.
Right. Well, Kim, again, I want to thank you so much for being with us. It's been just an absolute pleasure talking with you, and we've learned so much. Thank you for being so generous with your time and your knowledge. We hope to have you back again to update us again. Hopefully, in some future time, we'll be talking about a new government. You can tell us about all the wonderful tax reforms that are going to come along once we emerge from our capital L liberal winter, long-suffering winter, almost an ice age. But no, but actually, thank you very much for being here. It's been our great pleasure to have you
Yeah.
as
My
our
pleasure. Thanks for
guest
having me.
on. Okay, thank you.